This is chapter 5 and 6 of the Witchery of Archery. Remember, this was a different time in the 1800s, so the way they looked at the world was considerably different than how we look at it now. Chapter 5, Hare or Rabbit Shooting. The hare has always been considered the most timid as well as the most tender of animals. My hare was often the very softest and sweetest phrase in the Roman language. In the days of the Empire, Muy lupus was the words of endearment breathed into the damsel's ear by the loving youth just ready to don the toga. The reason of this will be well understood by whomsoever has had the exquisite pleasure of devouring a broiled rabbit saddle served with brown gravy for breakfast. The rabbit, or if we follow the naturalists, the hare, is found everywhere in the eastern part of the United States, from Florida to the Great Lakes of the north. With us as a people, the name is rabbit, no matter what the zoologist may say, and no matter how many varieties may be found, but the hunter knows the gray rabbit from the brown hare as well as he knows a woodcock from a partridge. And the epicure is at once disgusted when he finds out his servant has purchased for his table a long-legged woods hare, instead of the delicately penciled gray rabbit he ordered, the difference in flavor and the consistency of the flesh being quite marked. In the southern states, where the forests are thickly grown with pine underbrush, rabbits are exceedingly numerous. They're passed everywhere, crossing and recrossing each other. Taking advantage of the habit of following well-defined trails, the niggers of the south trap and snare large numbers of them. I will wager you a good bow you miss your first hare, although you may find him crouched in his form not 10 paces from you. In fact, while he is a good large mark, he is very difficult to hit before you have learned by experience just how to aim at him. In still hunting, you will generally find him in his form, his body and neck elongated as if the weather is fine, contracted as if it was cold and windy. His ears pressed flat upon his shoulders, his chin resting on his forefeet, he is fast asleep. With his big black eyes wide open, he looks larger by half than he really is, which is apt to make you shoot carelessly, thinking it is easy to hit him. You draw with great deliberation and let drive. Whack goes your arrow through the grass, the weeds in which he lies, but to your utter amazement, up springs the frightened rabbit and scuds away, like a bit of gray paper before a gust of the wind. You do not get another shot at him. He hunts his hole. Upon examination, you will find that you have overshot him, and your arrow is sticking in the ground just behind his form and slanting back, and above and across it towards you. This is your first and most important lesson in rabbit shooting. Hereafter you will aim low, yes, entirely too low, for your next rabbit gets up from his form before you see him, and after a half dozen long lazy bounds, squats on his haunches and waits for you to shoot at him. You aim low and let fly, and have the chagrin to see your arrow fall 10 feet short. The rabbit resolves himself into an ecstasy of billowing undulation, outrunning the other one by several seconds on the mile, and you're left leaning on your bow, pensively longing for the shotgun. The third time is a charm, mayhap. You bowl your game over in fine style, and you can never feel prouder or happier. A week or two of daily practice in good rabbit cover will get you well up towards successful shooting at this game. Rabbits have, especially when wounded, an inexplicable habit of running in a circuit of only a few hundred feet in diameter. I once followed one, according to my notes, 17 times around the periphery of 2 acres of brushy land before I finally secured him. And often in hunting, I have found it a good plan when a rabbit has been wounded and he has made one turn around a circuit to stand and await his appearance at any point, while another bowman follows on his track. I recollect a singular incident connected with this particular habit, so characteristic of the rabbit that I will relate it as illustrative of its foolish simplicity, as well as the untiring energy and dogged persistence of a weasel. I was standing near a worm fence that enclosed a small patch of wheat just beginning to head, watching for a cock quail, which I was decoying, when a rabbit ran past me, keeping between the fence and the wall of green shoot. It was too late in the season for rabbit shooting, so I allowed it to go unharmed. To my surprise, in a second or two, a small brown weasel rushed by in the track of the flying game. I hastily sent an arrow at the earnest little thing, but missed it. A few moments elapsed, and the rabbit, having made the circuit of the wheat, again ran by me. I looked sharply out for the weasel and got another hurried shot at him. but in those days I had the little experience in shooting at roving objects, and my arrow plowed up the ground in front of him. He did not even halt, but running right over the shaft, kept on in full chase of his intended victim. Round and round that little field went pursuer and pursued, till the circuit had been made no less than a dozen times. Finally, despairing of being able to hit the weasel with an arrow while it was running, I seized a club and watched for it again, rushed after it had passed, intending to overtake and kill it. My movement, while it was not in the least discomfort or startle the weasel, caused a rabbit to break into the wheat and start diagonally across the field, and the weasel following. Both were at once out of my sight. In less than 10 seconds I heard the rabbit squeal and knew the race was over, the wheat having impeded the flight of the larger animal without being any hindrance to that of the smaller. Hurrying to the spot, I found the rabbit with its throat cut and the weasel complacently sucking the blood from the wound. My cudgel soon made end of the little vampire. In southern woods, hare shooting by moonlight is fine sport. You must be able to hit your game as it scuds past you at leisurely lope or at full run. The spot has to be chosen in an open glade where the woods hares congregate to play in the sand or chase each other back and forth. You select a bush for cover and await your chance for a shot. Of course, it requires nice skill to enable you to aim just far enough ahead of your bounding game, but you soon will acquire it, and it will be surprisingly how often you will hit. Mr. Hansard recommends hunting rabbits with a spaniel trained to the bow. He says, all the world has probably seen or heard of a Briton ferry, a magnificent sea view near Swansea on the shores of the Glamorganshire. The road hence to the ferry passes over about 4 miles of beautiful velvet turf called the Burrows, and although patches of yellow blooming gorse are scattered here and there, it is generally plain, bare, and level as a bowling green. Thousands of rabbits inhabit this charming spot, and a better situation for an archer to acquire dexterity I do not believe exists. It will greatly enhance the pleasure of this sport if the archer provides himself with a brace of dwarf spaniels or beagles of the smallest size, which must be broken especially to the bow, just as the falconer trains a setter for his particular sport. When brought to hunt within 20 or 30 yards of the archer's feet, they may be considered sufficiently under command. If a rabbit gets up and runs in a direct line from the shooter, he may aim somewhat before its head. The same allowance holds good for a cross shot. But for all this, I cannot lay down any precise rules because the distance varies according to the power of the bow, which for flying a running shot should be rather below the archer's strength. The English archers used to keep 2 choice bows each, one for war, very, very heavy, and one for hunting, weak and slender. This because in war, long range and great penetration of the shaft was required, and in hunting, quickness of cast and perfect manageability was preferred to great power and consistent cumbersomeness. From 40 to 50 pounds is a good weight for a small game hunting bow. If you are very strong and agile, you may use one of 60 or 70 pound draw. For rabbit shooting, use light but broad-headed arrows, sharp-pointed and barbed. Chapter 6. Bow Shooting with a Hermit. We were scarcely aware of the coming of a squall until it struck us and reversed our sail, as a side flaw almost always does when an incompetent person is at the helm. I remember that the boom struck me a sharp rap on the head as it swept around, and in a moment we were driven upon a sandbar and our boat capsized. We had barely time enough to snatch up our bows and leap out before this occurred, and then a big wave swept over us with great force, landing us all in a heap on the bar, where it left us high and out of the water, but by no means dry. Our boat must have foundered, for we never saw it again. We all had presence of mind enough to leap up and run to a point above the reach of the next wave. Will had lost his quiver with all his arrows in the struggle, and Caesar, our Negro man of all work, had allowed the sea to swallow our haversack, provisions and all. My arrows, however, 34 of them, were safe at my side, and our bows were uninjured notwithstanding the water, they having been oiled that very morning. "Now look what you've done, Caesar," cried Will, in stentorian tones, addressing the already terribly frightened African. "Look at what you've done. Why don't you keep the boat before the wind? I've a mind to thrash the ground with you." Never mind, Mars Will. I's done killed already. I neck broke for sure. Kai, what a brief old Weber dat was. This child not go and stand responsible for such uncommon whirly gusts as that, I tell you now. After this little word passage, we all three stood gazingly stupidly at each other, the wind almost lifting us from our feet, and the water streaming down our persons. It may well be understood that we were in a rather startling predicament, literally cast upon an uninhabited island, with no boat in which to leave it, and with not a soul in the world likely to search for us. But I did not desire to appear sensational in writing this matter-of-fact sketch, and I am sure that after the first excitement of our shipwreck had subsided, we took our disaster in very good part. In fact, Will laughed immoderately, and if any one of us was really frightened, it was Caesar. Nonetheless, the predicament remained. Our camp was some 5 miles away on the mainland, and hidden from our view by a cluster of diminutive islands. Our boat was gone, and there we stood, the three as utter exiles as ever storm had banished. The gale was most furious for about an hour or so, then it subsided almost as suddenly as it had risen. We sat down on the sand to rest after our struggle with the elements, our faces to the sea and our backs towards the frondous tuft of trees crowning the central swell of the island. The waves were singing a grand song and flinging up their white hands as if keeping time to the music. The sun was barely above the eastern horizon, and now as the clouds broke away, he threw athwart the rushy islands and the heaving waters a flood of soft splendor not unlike that of a northern Indian summer. A few white gulls flew wildly about, drifting down the wind and skimming the summits of the whitecaps. The pleasant exhilaration attendant on adventure took possession of me, and as I sat there, with the roar of the sea dimming in my ears, I thought of Selkirk and Robinson Crusoe, and half wished that some of their experiences might befall us. We looked in vain for any sign of our boat. Not even a splinter cheered our eyes. Far southward, I once thought I caught sight of a sail, but I was not sure. We all remained silent a long time, and I had just begun a study of Caesar's lugubrious profile when Will, the most practical of men, suggested that we might find a pleasanter place to discuss our accident by an exploration of our island. This startled Caesar from his reverie, and getting upon our feet, we took our way along the ridge of sand towards the timbered part of the hummock, a half-mile west of us. The water slushed in our boots, and the sand made our progress very toilsome, but we persevered, and soon we entered a rushy tide swale, through which we floundered to a gentle slope strewed with tufts of Spanish bayonet and occasional palm trees. Toiling up this slope, we came into a beautiful grove of palmettos, set on a considerable bluff overlooking the calm stretch of land-sheltered water, beyond which lay the low tide of the Florida coast. The sun was now high enough to begin to heat the air, and at Caesar's suggestion we took off our clothes, wrung the water from them, and hung them to dry. Having no change of garments, we had to lay around quite naked until nearly noon, before the sun and the wind had done their work sufficiently. This was just to Caesar's taste, and he sought out the sunniest spot to be found, where he stretched himself at full length and slept the oleaginous sleep that only a Negro can know, with his face half buried in the hot sand. As for me, I managed to dry some tobacco, and going out to the nose of the bluff, sat down under a bushy pine and lighted my pipe. And thanks to my box, my matches were uninjured. From this position, I could see a long crescent of the island, fringed with rushes and tall flag-like grass, and here and there, densely wooded, running close between two smaller bars that seemed barely disconnected from the mainland. Two large flocks of waterfowl, sweeping down at a certain point between the two tufts of the forest, told me plainer than words could have that a sheltered estuary whereabout offered a feeding place for the birds, and I felt sure that some rare sport if the spot could be reached. But how to reach it? In my then condition, the question was too abstruse for me, as I contented myself watching the broad, literal face of the water smiling so sweetly and benignly back at the now cloudless and peaceful sky. Through the thin wreaths of smoke floating up through my pipe, I had a dreamy vision for a long time of rays of splendor parted into fine gossamer-like shreds, and then I fell into a sweet slumber, laying there with the salt breeze blowing over my free limbs, and the song of the sea gently pouring through my dream. Boat ahoy! I turned in my sleep and half awoke. Boat ahoy! I sprang to my feet. The sun was almost to the meridian, and the sea was like a sheet of glass, Will and Caesar had finally dressed themselves, and having tied my shirt to a long stick, the latter was waving it frantically, while the former shouted at the top of his voice, "Boat ahoy!" And presently there came a thin, clear shout in response from a long, low skiff, which, with a single individual as a captain and crew, was hugging the dusky fringe of a marsh half a mile away. I picked up my pipe and ran down to the companions, and as I saw the little vessel set her prow in our direction, and got in my clothes as quickly as possible. Capital luck, cried Will. We'll hire the fellow and take us back to Berkeley's. The man pulled towards us very leisurely, and when he had come to within a bowshot of us, he backed his oars, swinging a heavy double-barreled shotgun across his lap, and called out, "Well, what's wantin'?" "We want to get away from here," cried Will. "We were in a squall this morning and had our boat wrecked, and we're here in sort of a tight fix." "Well, who are ye?" was the response in a half-growl, the tones of which rasped across the water like a file. He bowed his head as he spoke, as if in deep thought. "We're a party from over at Berkeley's," I answered, "and we want to get back there. We'll pay you well for your trouble if you'll pull us over." "What's them you got in your hands?" "Longbows." "What'd you say?" "Bows and arrows." "Bows. Things to shoot with." "Yes." We heard the fellow mutter something as if to himself, and then he let go a roar of laughter that set his boat to rocking, and fairly startled us with its suddenness and intensity. "Bows and arrows, you say?" "To be sure," put in Caesar, "to be sure. And they outshoot your lame old shotgun, too, I tell you now." The man laughed again, and then taking his oars he pulled up and very promptly came ashore. He was a little wiry fellow, 60 years old, perhaps, and apparently none the worse for wear. His hair was stiff, long, and iron gray, and as were his beard and eyebrows. He was dressed in a shirt and trousers of coarse cotton cloth resembling ordinary bed ticking, and had on an old greasy otter-skin cap. His feet were clothed in a sort of moccasin boot, evidently of his own make. His shotgun, a very long one, was a fine English manufacture, number 10 gauge, and of about 13 pounds weight. "Well, well, how do you all do?" he said, looking curiously from one of us to the other of us, and letting his eyes at last fix themselves on Will's 6-foot 6-inch snakeskin bow, a beautifully finished weapon. We responded very civilly, and proceeded to explain more particularly our disaster and nature of our predicament. He listened apparently with much interest, and when the story was finished, he winked at me and said, "Got any tobacco about your old clothes?" "Old clothes," repeated Caesar with a chuckle. "Like to know what 'em call good clothes, yeah. I promptly offered my pouch, but found that it was chewing tobacco he wanted. "Here, Caesar," said Will, "out with your dog leg and let this gentleman have a chew." The Negro good-naturedly obeyed, and produced a long black twist of Old Virginia. "That's the decoyment," cried the old man delightfully. "That's the decoyment, darky. We'll just divide this here weed right here." So saying, he drew a large knife and severed the twist, handing back to Caesar about a third of the smaller end thereof, and deposited an enormous quid in his mouth. He added, "That's the clear stuff. Thanks. Thank ye, boy, thank ye." Caesar grinned confusedly, seeing how his store of precious creature comfort was diminished, but made no remark. "I suppose you've got no such thing as a flask of the joyful juice, nor nothing, eh?" I replied that unfortunately we had nothing of the sort. Well, that can't be a help, I suppose. But a drop of the stuff wouldn't be unwholesome about now," he added. "The next thing," said Will, "is to get you to pull us back to Berkeley's. What do you say?" "Well, I don't know. It's too hot just now. We might as well lay around in the shade here till towards evening and talk the matter over. It's a good 10 miles from here to Berkeley's, and I'm not going to try that again, both wind and tide, and right in the heat of the day, too. But will you agree to take us? We're in no hurry to be off, and I know of nothing excepting that we might get rather hungry." "Never mind about something to eat," said the old fellow. "I've got grub enough for us all in my hamper yonder. Broiled fish, duck, little bread, and a few oranges. Suppose we can make out. Thought that you're two uncommon powerful feeders. And as for taking ye over to Berkeley, suppose I can do it, seeing you're in a fix. But the main thing with me about now is to know what in the world you is doing way out here and playing around with these here bows and arrows. There was a smack of genuine curiosity in his voice and manner which I could not refrain from respecting, so that when we lounged in the shade, I took pains to relate to him many of the pleasantest adventures by field and flood with longbow. He listened with quick, sincere interest of a child, and by the time the tide had turned, I had evidently won both his respect and admiration. When we had eaten his food, he proved very palatable, and having struck a bargain with him, we were on the point of embarking in a skiff. He suddenly proposed that, as it was a good pull to Berkeley's, we should go to his cabin on a neighboring island for the night and proceed to Berkeley's in the morning. As if by way of sauce to the suggestion, he said we could take the estuary before mentioned in our way, and have an hour or two of good sport shooting wildfowl. Nothing could have better pleased us. The proposition was quickly accepted, and 5 minutes later we were in a staunch boat sweeping at no mean speed down the wooded crescent that flanked the feeding place of the wildfowl. The old man, as he pulled us along with slow, steady strokes, told us he was living just of the sort of life that pleased him. He was as happy as he desired to be. He had a little place over on the island yonder, a few orange trees, a garden spot, some bananas, some fig trees, and a few other comforts suited to his mode of life. For the rest, he fished and took the world easy. He didn't see any use of the people rushing and racing after wealth when contentment and ease were so much more preferable. How long had he been living here? 30 years. Was at the point of death with consumption when he came, from Tennessee I believe, and now see how hale and strong he was for one of his years. We drew on, and passing around the sickle-like point of the crescent, and through the narrow way between the high walls of rushes, swept into a singular pond-like place, where tufts of tall grass dotted the surface of the water, which was literally alive with fowl. I shared my 34 arrows with Will, and when everything was ready, the sport began. The old man refused to fire his shot. It was good enough for him to watch our display of archery, and this was uncommonly sharp at times. In fact, we never did better work than on that evening. Some half-accidental wing shots resulting from letting drive through a bunch of ducks as they rose from the water particularly pleased our boatman, and then when I clipped a redhead through the quartering shot over 50 yards of water, he clapped his hands and most emphatically and profanely praised both my skill and my lemonwood weapon, which this latter was the first of the kind I had ever tried, and proved to be a marvel of elasticity and power. Part of the time I took my stand on a low tussock, keeping well hidden in the high grass, whence I had some beautiful shots at short distances, scoring a number of charming hits, but losing arrows so rapidly that presently, to my surprise, I had but 7 left. After this I took none but fair chances, and shot with great care. My companions in the canoe kept drifting slowly around here and there, continually driving the birds to me, and if I had a fresh sheaf of arrows I could have killed scores. I was astonished to find them so tame. Quite often, when I knocked one over, his companions would, instead of flying away, swim curiously around about the fluttering victim. This is one of the beauties of hunting with our weapon. The short, dull sound of the bow's recoil can be heard but a little distance, and the sharp whisper of the well-sent arrow is not of a character to frighten game. When we left that estuary, it was yet literally moving with fowl, and we had killed a great number. It was so many shots from a fowling piece that had been fired there, not a wing would have remained, and the mere noise itself would have driven them away. We had lost all our arrows when, about an hour from sunset, we slipped out through the narrow channel and pulled away for the low-lying island close to the mainland upon which our boatman lived. A steady pull of perhaps 3/4 of an hour over a peaceful sheet of sea brought us into the mouth of a slender creek, cutting with a graceful curve into the heart of the island. This was our way. We looked beyond a point of the marsh to our left and saw the sun like a mighty ball of red-hot metal just touching the far limit of the glorified sea, and then passed into the cool shade of trees that made a charming twilight, and soon we ran alongside of a pretty sailboat lying at anchor in the creek, putting to shore where the flight of wooden steps led up a little bluff. The old man bustled out and helped us ashore with our game, after which he led the way up to the steps where a broad path curved into an enclosure whose fence was a hedge of magnificent old orange trees. "Here's my possessions," he said, bidding us follow him. He walked rapidly along the path, drawing us into an orchard of some 600 orange trees in full fruit, passing through which we came into a garden of bananas, hedged with dusky fig and lemon trees. Beyond this, still and fronting a stretch of open sea, stood a low rambling house of 5 or 6 rooms built of round logs. Neatness and comfort everywhere. We were met at the door by a pleasant-looking old lady, our boatman's wife. A married son with his wife and 3 children dwelt there too, a family of hermits from whom we have more than a royal welcome. The old man grew more interesting as we became more familiar with his peculiarities, and both he and his household seemed delighted to have us for guests. I took great pleasure in answering the multitude of questions asked by the old and young, sitting up until far into the night describing places I had seen and adventures that had befallen me in my rambles. I can think of nothing more romantic than a situation and the circumstances of this isolated home on a wild island of the semi-tropics. Evidently it was a place of perfect peace and contentment, where sickness was unknown, and where good and bad effects of what are called refinement and culture had scarcely been heard of. Year after year they lived there among their orange, lemon, and pomegranate trees, their banana and figs, with no wants beyond the ready power of unaided nature to supply. Happy, healthy, and with nothing like real labor to do. I think they would have willingly sat up all night listening with all the sincerity of children to such scraps of incident and adventure as I could call to mind and relate for their amusement. Such utter simplicity would be hard to imagine if one had not witnessed it. That night we slept on dry, sweet beds of dried moss. As for me, my dreams were of an island home endowed with tropical fruit trees where I dwelt in the bosom of my family. Next morning we were taken out in a sailboat, which I had a charming voyage of 2 hours to Berkeley's. When we reached Berkeley's, nothing would do our old friend and his son but to have Will and me take a fresh supply of arrows and go back with them for a week's sport. So urgent and so evidently hearty as was his request that we complied, and that very evening we found us again at the quiet old home on the island. We tried to make up for such hospitality by loading the boat with a host of things we thought that might be acceptable to the family, taken from the store we had embellished at Berkeley's, among which were a set of delfware, some knives and forks, a small box of plug tobacco. I shall not give the name of this illiterate but honest and charming hospitable family, and my reason is easily understood. They are living there in that lonely home this day, and if their simple trustfulness and generosity and their exact place of residence were known to the host of tourists and rambling deadhead bores that every winter flock to the south, their peaceful retreat would soon become, to those ignorant but gentle hermits, unendurable. It is not the purpose of this chapter to give a detailed account of the many delightful adventures that befell us during the 8 days that we had of our headquarters at Hermit Home, as Will has ever since called the place. The old man and his son did little but take us here and there from one hunting ground to another, finding it a constant source of amusement to watch us shoot. We ran up a small stream some miles into the mainland once, and spent 2 days deer hunting. We saw but 1 deer, and this we did not kill. We got greater game, however, for the dogs treed a bear, and Will and I brought to earth with 5 arrows, one of which was a bodkin point I drove entirely through his head, passing in between one ear and the eye, and coming out on the other side just below the eye. This is the largest animal we had ever killed with a bow. His weight was about 300 pounds, I should guess, and although we have no means of ascertaining it, we gave the skin to the old man. While on this hunt, I got lost in a dense swamp and thought for a while I should never again see home and friends. Such a vile place as that swamp was, that I hoped to be forever clear of it. It was a paradise of snakes. I must have seen 1,000 moccasins. They were everywhere, on logs, tussocks, swimming in the water, writhing together among the tangled roots of trees, drying themselves on cypress knees, sliding and squirming about my feet, lapping their red forked tongues and leering at me from every conceivable place. They would not give the credence to a whole truth if I should tell it. For 4 terrible hours I waded around and round in that venomous place, shouting myself hoarse, blowing my whistle till my lips are sore. Finally I found a little ditch-like stream. Following this led me out. Near the stream, in the midst of the swamp, I came to an old half-rotten boat, which had once been painted blue. On the gunwale was still legible the inscription, USA 1832. No doubt this is a relic of some tragedy, but what was in its circumstances and who its actors, we can never know. The boat had been in its present position for many years, for considerable trees were growing in such a way as to show that they had sprung up since, and one end of the vessel, sunken deep into the swamp muck, was literally crushed in the grasp of the huge roots that had twined themselves around it. I was overjoyed when I again found my friends. I felt as though I had been delivered from something worse than a den of lions, and I imagined I had suffered all the horrors without the dementia of delirium tremens. The following night we camped on the beach, and having for our bed the soft warm sand, and for our canopy a sky as blue and resplendent as that of Italy. About midnight, happening to become wakeful and restless, I put on my clothes, and taking my bow and quiver, lighted my blanket and strolled leisurely around a point of rush marsh bordering a finger of shell beach a half-mile to the south of us. The moon, nearly at its full, was high, and shining with a power unknown in the latitudes further north. I could distinguish objects at a distance almost as readily as if by daylight, and a particular sheen of the water and dimly defined shadows of the rushes made beautiful lines of contrast all toward the mellow picture. The wind drew gently landward, sharp and fragrant, a real breath of the tropics. The tide made strong currents between the little islands offshore, down which porpoises ran, rising at regular intervals to cut the surface with their dingy swords, puffing like powerful submarine engines. I stopped at a certain point and gazed for a long time with a dreadful sort of interest on a charming sweep of sea and islands, clothed in the fantastic mantle of moon and starlight. Sometimes a myriad of silver mullet would leap up and fall back into the water like a shower of jewels, and anon a single skipjack would shoot almost vertically into the air, his fins whizzing like the wings of a quail. The all-pervading murmur of the sea seemed more like silence than sound, and although the combined light of the stars and moon were wonderfully strong, still a soft, mysterious wavering of the outlines of things gave them an unreal, ghostly semblance. The air, although coming from over leagues and leagues of water, was particularly dry and pleasant to the lungs. Consumption would not be generated in that region. It's a very garden of health. While I stood there leaning on my bow and enjoying the influence of the night, I became aware of certain small, shadowy forms, stealthily but nimbly running out of the rushes down to the beach to the surf line. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, more than 100 of them marshalling within distance of 300 or 400 yards, some no further away than a good bow shot. My attention now called to them. I could hear them quarreling in sharp tones while they made a munching sound as if cracking shells with their teeth. They looked rather something larger like cats and ran rather than rambled along with their backs bowed up and their round tails held straight out behind. Now and again a half dozen or more of them would rush together, apparently in great anger, fight furiously for a few seconds, then separate, each individual going his way, none the worse from the contest. It was a weird masquerade, its effect heightened by the stillness of the night and deceptive glamour of the moonshine. While I watched that, it was half sleepy interest, characteristic of one who has got up at midnight from restless slumber. Suddenly a great bird swept by me, passing not more than 20 feet from my head. It sped like a ray of darkness, making not the slightest noise with its wings, and struck one of the small animals like a bolt. The sharp cry of anger and pain, then a general stampede of the masqueraders as they rushed to the marsh grass in the direction of the densely timbered swamp, leaving a beach clear with the exception of the bird and its victim, now struggling in a silent, ominous way. Evidently it was a matter of life and death with the contending parties, a close, hard wrestle for the mastery. I strung my bow as quickly as I could, and running forward a few paces nearer, I drew and let drive with a good aim as I could. The arrow left the string with a clear whirring sound, and I heard it strike a dull thud as the great bird tumbled over and began a loud flapping of its wings. I hurried to the spot and found the largest owl I ever saw, pierced through by the arrow, and nearby lay a raccoon dying from the wounds the bird had given it. I had frequently before seen owls and hawks strike smaller animals, but this was something rare. The raccoon was a very large one. Possibly my arrow may have helped to kill it, but I think it did not. I took my bird to the camp, and refreshed by my curious adventure, lay down and slept till sunrise. The following day we returned to the Hermit's Island, and the next we went back to Berkeley's, whence the season being about over, we made our way to the hill country of North Georgia to spend the summer in the pleasant valley, the Conswatee, where the bass fishing is best that I know of in the world.
Smash the subscribe button, such as you would, you'll feel some foe.